Godly Heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View, and it's going to be quite an interesting week. We'll talk about that as we go along, but let me just mention we have a couple of articles for you to look at, and we're going to work our way through about this first half hour of some things happening in the news and give you some perspective that maybe you won't hear anywhere else. Then we're going to be talking with Lindsey Swindle. She has really developed a great ministry to pray for elected officials, and if you look at your calendar, isn't it hard to believe? It's just about May, and that is May 1st is Thursday, and that would be then, of course, the National Day of Prayer. So it seems to me that we'll start this week out encouraging you to pray for officials. On Thursday, we'll be talking about that as well, and I might just mention that on that Thursday, I'll be doing a live broadcast from our radio station KYCC in Stockton, California. The reason for that is that night we will be celebrating 50 years of faithful broadcasting for KYCC, so that's something coming up later in the week. Next hour, we will have Lathan Watts. He was supposed to be with us last week, but I believe we will see him in studio today. We'll talk about their case dealing with religious liberty in Oklahoma. Also want to get his thoughts about this case that was argued before the Supreme Court already and how that also affects the issue of religious liberty. I might get his comment about a few other issues in the news, since he brings a wealth of information and experience, not just in the legal profession, but with his historical background and just his perspective on so many different issues. So that's just a brief overview of what we're going to try to cover today. But it seemed to me that it would be appropriate, especially after what happened on Friday and what transpired over the weekend, to talk about two judges who were arrested. If for no other reason than I've started to see articles coming out saying this just illustrates once again Trump administration is turning into this an authoritarian regime. And then I've seen some other articles, as a matter of fact, which I think are much more accurate, saying if what we know is true, these two judges deserve to be arrested, indicted, and probably prosecuted and put behind bars. So we'll see where that goes. If you're not familiar, certainly you have not been in the news cycle, because you've probably heard a little bit about the ex-judge, Jose Luis Cano, retired actually in March from a county in New Mexico, who has been accused, and it seems to me there's pretty good evidence of destroying incriminating evidence of an individual who is here illegally. There, by the way, are a number of incriminating photos. We'll get into that in just a minute, as well as whether or not he even allowed the individual to have a semi-automatic weapon and all sorts of other things. We'll get to that, of course. And then the other one happened in Milwaukee County. That's a circuit court judge, Hannah Dugan. And let me start with the obvious disclaimer. Just because you're indicted doesn't mean you're guilty. You've heard the phrase before, you can indict a ham sandwich. So just because these individuals are indicted doesn't necessarily mean that we should jump to a conclusion. You are allowed in this country to be innocent till proven guilty, even though the press never covers it that way. And yet, when we look at those documents, so far, it looks really quite bad, which is why I've posted this first article by David Devil, in which he reminds us that we, for many months this last year, were hearing no one is above the law. And that's true, whether you're talking about the President of the United States, whether you're talking about the President of the United States' son, in this case, you would talk about Hunter Biden, or the current president, certainly everybody from Joe Biden to Barack Obama to, of course, Donald Trump, as that is indeed the case. Okay, so he spends a little bit of time reminding us of the fact that there seems to be a philosophy here. No one is above the law except liberal judges who break the law to protect illegal aliens. No one's above the law except maybe the President of the United States and his son. Okay, so we'll leave that as it is. But now we're talking about the fact that the Justice Department announced on Friday that, of course, this judge, Judge Kano, formerly judge, and his wife Nancy were arrested for evidence of tampering offenses related to the federal investigation and prosecution of a Venezuelan national residing unlawfully within the United States with alleged ties to Tren de Aragua, which again is a organized terrorist group now, according to this administration. They were destroying incriminating evidence, including the phone of this individual, which contained incriminating photos, videos of him with firearms, which we've already mentioned in passing, and the rest. And they recovered other devices which also had incriminating evidence. Looks pretty straightforward, but let's get on to the next one, which was discussed at CNN. I'll get to that in just a minute. And that is Milwaukee County Circuit Judge Hannah Dugan, arrested for alleged interference with a federal law enforcement operation, unlawful concealment of an individual subject to arrest. And this has to do with the fact that they had law enforcement agencies attempting to execute an administrative removal warrant for an individual. In this case, it was a Mexican national who had already been removed from the United States at least once and was in this judge's court for domestic abuse charges. According to that, then this individual personally escorted this Mexican national, I'm not intentionally using those individuals' names, and the attorney through a restricted jury door exit, not typically used for defendants or attorneys. According to the affidavit that was filed, this action allowed the defendant and his lawyer to exit the court and temporarily get past the federal agencies. But after a short chase on foot, they were able to apprehend him. And so here is a case where, again, the judge actively and knowingly aided a criminal defendant in evading federal law enforcement. Both judges, of course, as we might have already implied, face prison time. And yet you've had a number of people in the media say, no, this is just a good example of now the president and his minions are going after judges they dislike. But the evidence is pretty clear, and it even showed up on CNN, in which you had, for example, Scott Jennings making the case that this whole spectacle is important because the message is being sent to everybody else that we're not going to put up with this. And there have been two arguments. Argument number one, well, these people should not be arrested. Argument number two, they should not be put in handcuffs. And again, my argument is, well, then tell that to some of the individuals that were associated with Donald Trump who were put in handcuffs. Think of Peter Navarro. He's at the airport flying to go do an interview. They catch him, they handcuff him, and he's even asking, can I at least call the producer, tell him I don't think I'm going to make it to that TV show? Or think of Roger Stone, I should say, who actually, because CNN was tipped off, you have this picture of SWAT agents coming to his house in the daylight, CNN taking pictures so that we can perp walk him out the door. Now, I think the argument should be, let's stop some of this attempt at a perp walk because this is all an attempt to try to embarrass an individual. But Scott Jennings was making the case that, no, maybe this one made some sense because if some judges see other judges being hauled away in handcuffs, maybe they won't be then aiding individuals illegally to avoid the customs enforcement agencies. Anyway, that's what's transpired over the weekend. We'll talk about it today here on Point of View. Be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The Trump administration froze federal grants to Harvard University and set in motion a debate about what the president can do when universities defy an executive order and a Supreme Court decision. This confrontation first began when the Trump administration threatened to pull federal funding from Columbia University because administrators did little to stop anti-Semitism on campus. When the Trump administration tried the same tactic, Harvard did not comply. The Harvard president declared that no government, regardless of which party is in power, should decide what private universities can teach, whom they can admit and hire, and which areas of study and inquiry they can pursue. Harvard's transgressions go beyond their refusal to rein in anti-Semitism against Jewish students. The Supreme Court ruled against Harvard's admission practices that discriminated against potential Asian students, and Donald Trump issued an executive order to dismantle DEI. Both the Obama and Biden administrations threatened colleges with their unconstitutional interpretation of Title IX. The Trump administration is not only threatening but pulling university funding and has even asked the IRS to investigate whether Harvard should be allowed to keep its tax-exempt status. I wonder if Trump is creating a precedent that a future president might use against Christian colleges, charities, and institutions. This isn't just hypothetical. Nearly 50 years ago, the IRS stripped Bob Jones University of its tax-exempt status. The Trump administration may not affect Harvard since it has built up an endowment of $50 billion, but other institutions would not be able to endure a future administration that pulls federal funding or tax exemption. That is why this federal action is so important. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, while we are talking about individuals that are here illegally, it certainly seems to me that it brings us back to something that even Robert Knight wrote about today. I haven't posted his article, but you can find it at Washington Times, and certainly we've posted him enough times that if you just go and type in his name, you can find the link and find the most recent one, because he was asking another very important question. That is, all of a sudden, everybody is really concerned, at least on the left, about due process of these individuals that are here illegally. And he asked a very good question. Where were those individuals that seemingly weren't concerned about the due process of the individuals that were incarcerated, sometimes without even a trial and without a habeas corpus or anything else being applied, that these were J6ers? And again, some of these individuals that were behind bars weren't even in the Capitol, but were there held as well. So again, I think the argument should be that if you are concerned about the due process of somebody who's here illegally, where were you when due process was not given to people who were here legally and were not even involved in what was called an insurrection at the time? And I think more probably should have been called a riot. The same argument, the people that are now upset about the fact that two judges were actually handcuffed, didn't seem all that concerned when Peter Navarro, by the way, haven't you seen him out recently talking about tariffs? So it's not like this guy's a real criminal, but he's at the airport and can't even get on the plane and can't even make a phone call to say, because they wanted to know what his name of his lawyer was, and he didn't tell them what the lawyer's name was, so they wouldn't let him. I mean, just all the game that was played there. Of course, Roger Stone showing up at his house, 6 o'clock in the morning, tipping off CNN so that we can perp walk him and all the rest. You lose your opportunity for outrage when you don't play the game fairly. And again, I'd be the first to say, I think some of this of trying to get a perp walk and trying to embarrass individuals, especially when all you have is an indictment, and sometimes the indictments tend to be wrong. And just imagine how you can just ruin a person's public image by getting an indictment and then having a heavy-handed set of, whether it's FBI or a variety of other people in law enforcement, handcuff you while cameras are rolling and thus affect you in ways that are inappropriate. And so I would agree with the argument, but where were you when some of the people associated with Donald Trump were treated that way? And if you wanted to play it fair, okay, then I think I would be more open to some of the things you're saying. Let's, if we can, though, while we're talking about what is going on right now at the border, recognize that they just announced, at least in the Trump administration, that about 85 miles of new border wall is under construction. So I think that's an encouragement to say that maybe some of that in the past will reduce the number of individuals crossing the border, although right now the numbers and percentages are at an all-time low. But there's something else. The argument has been made that when the president invoked the Alien Enemies Act, this had to do with an invasion, and a lot of people said, well, it's not an invasion. Yes, a lot of people crossing the border, but it's not an invasion. And all I would say is let's point now to the most recent document that has come out from the FBI. And this FBI report indicates that Venezuela's Marxist dictator, that would be Nicolas Maduro, has been using Tren de Aragua as a paramilitary proxy force to, and now this is the quote, to destabilize Chile, Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, and the United States. And so when the borders were open, Maduro used this as an opportunity to move these gangs and criminals into this country and into other countries. And the most disturbing part of this FBI report is that over the next 6 to 18 months, there are concerned that there could be a literal war inside the United States with these individuals who are part of these gangs who have the desire and have the plan to assassinate any Venezuelans in this country who are critical of the Marxist regime. And so you can see that right now this FBI report is, I think, a wake-up call. I would imagine you're hearing about this for the very first time on Point of View. The only other person that has covered this well, and let's give credit where credit is due, is in the Friday report by Gary Bauer. And in a sense, this shows exactly what is taking place. By the way, Gary Bauer also points out that not only are we not hearing about this report because of this constant drumbeat about Trump causing a constitutional crisis, if you look at the latest poll that came out, yes, 50% of Americans think conditions at the southern border are better, but only 50%. 22% think it's worse, and 23% think nothing has changed. And he says, how is this possible? Well, that's because the press will not cover the fact that illegal immigration is at a record low. So again, it illustrates the need to get your news from more than just the legacy media, and to, again, in this particular case, recognize that the FBI is sounding a warning about the impact that some of these gangs, especially those from Venezuela, might have in this country. Just before we take a break, let me mention one other issue. The third article I've posted here is one in which there is an interview with Gordon Chang. He's been on the program with us many times before, and he has been arguing, I think, very significantly that even though you're hearing that these Trump tariffs are a failure, he says they really are having an impact in China. Well, again, I will defer to Gordon Chang. He knows a lot more about China than I do. having been able to not only have contacts in this country and also being able to read Chinese, he understands this only so well. He was on Fox Business the other day to talk about the fact that he says basically that there is a real win coming for Donald Trump because China is now caving on this issue. Those tariffs hurt them more than they hurt us. They aren't exactly helping some of the manufacturers right now in this country, but they're hurting Chinese manufacturers and exporters even worse. And as a result, China has been trying to create as many exemptions for its tariffs as possible for some of the U.S. goods. So even though you'll still be hearing, and I'm sure it'll be a drumbeat for some time, about how these tariffs, these outrageous and significant tariffs in China and in the United States, are hurting American manufacturers and American importers because it's preventing Chinese exporters. We're starting to see some exemptions coming in as well. And Donald Trump has talked with the Chinese Communist Party on more than a few occasions, which is so interesting because, again, if you just take the word of the legacy media, they say that the Chinese say, we haven't met with him at all. And yet there's evidence that that is the case. And yet they will report without even pointing out that the Chinese communists are known for lying about things. You have to have at least a little more discernment in that regard. Real quickly, Gordon Chang's last comment is China is doing all of this and actually of creating some of these exemptions, but it's not announcing it. It's not just imposing the tariffs on aviation products, industrial chemicals, and semiconductors. It's really the Chinese way of doing it. And so what you're going to have for a while is a back and forth taking place. But he predicts that this back and forth ultimately could go on for a fairly long period of time. But ultimately, his argument is that the Chinese dictator, Xi Jinping, has put himself in a box, and he believes that a deal is coming in the future. We'll see where it goes, but I did want you to see this article because, again, you get one kind of perspective about the tariffs and China by watching the legacy media and reading some of those articles. You get an entirely different perspective from people like Gordon Chang. One last time, let's go ahead and mention that we still do have the Take Action item up, and this is an opportunity for you to tell your 2 United States senators that you would like to prevent and believe we should prevent people that are here illegally and are not citizens from voting in federal elections. This has to do with the SAVE Act. We've talked about that before, and that is available on the website at pointofview.net. My Viewpoints commentary is about Harvard University and the issue and the back and forth between Harvard University and the Trump administration. And I thought it was kind of interesting because Karen, in order to get your attention, posted a Form 990. It would be fun to post the Form 990 from Harvard University. That would shock you by how much money they have. But when you take a break, we'll be back with more right after this.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
You know, I mentioned at the outset that we certainly have our National Day of Prayer coming up on Thursday. And of course, we should be praying for those in authority every single day. And that is something that the Apostle Paul encouraged Timothy. If you've ever read 1 Timothy, the first chapter is just kind of a general understanding of what to do. And then as he begins to set forth in what is now our second chapter, they didn't have chapter divisions back then, He says, first of all, I urge that supplications, prayers, and intercessions and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. Now, it does seem to me that we should always be praying for what I call our key 16. If you identify individuals that are in authority over you, that of course would be your president, 9 Supreme Court justices, 2 U.S. senators, 1 representative. Usually have a state senator, state representative, a governor, but you can come up with a number that's different than that, but that works pretty well for most of us. But I thought it would be important for you to know a little bit more about an organization called Project Keep. Stands for Keeping Elected Officials Encouraged Through Prayer. And it is a project that is associated with Medishare. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a minute as well. And it's been put together by Lindsey Swindle. She is an individual that graduated from the University of Central Florida with degrees both in political science and interpersonal and organizational communications. Has a master's degree as well in public administration. And prior to joining Medishare, served as the chief legislative assistant for 2 state senators. She is an individual that now has a responsibility there to address some of these political issues at Medishare, and also is a licensed foster parent. So, Lindsey, welcome to Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby, so much for the opportunity.
I might just mention we have posted your article here. It actually is under your picture there, entitled Speak Up for Your Elected Officials in Prayer. And I thought it would be good because you actually help us get to know you a little bit. There are individuals that can remember when they would have a TV set on in school, and yet your interest was when they had C-SPAN on in school, which I think shows the desire that you always had to get involved in political life.
Definitely. It was, even though seeing that on TV as a 10th grader in high school, and really it was our teacher that helped push us towards that. And I love to talk, always got in trouble as a kid for excessive talking, but hearing people share with their elected officials, and she said they have the ears of those in government, and that really perked me up. And I said, I don't want anyone else speaking on my behalf. How do I learn more about this? How can I get involved? And it was something, like you said, that C-SPAN, just daily call-in show that really let me hear the heart of what was going on in our world at the time and in our country. And I just thought it was so interesting that, wow, I get an opportunity to be a part of this.
Well,
and then that brought me to...
We've had various people over the years that have listened to Point of View. Same thing. Just as you were listening to C-SPAN, they've been listening to Point of View and got involved in political life. But continue. I just think that was an encouragement just to say why we think some of these talk shows are so important.
Definitely so. It's bringing that information, and that really led me on, how do I work in this? And so I feel very blessed that I get to be the Director of Government and Policy Affairs here at Medishare. And, when I first came on and having a passion for this, being able to represent our ministry that, is comprised of a community of believers who get to share in each other's medical costs for over 30 years. And they pray for one another, too, on the daily. So we've got employees praying for members calling in. Our members are encouraging one another when they're going through medical, either difficult time with a difficult diagnosis, or they're praying for one another when they're a first-time parent. So prayer has been woven into every part in this process. And then I also get to bring in, like you brought up, 1 Timothy, and how we're called to pray for our elected officials.
Since you did mention Medishare, let's mention that you have a new CEO, and I know that's Chief Executive Officer, which will be effective May 12th, 2025. And so we have, of course, talked about Medishare in the past, and again, we have some links there as well. But let's again maybe focus on your political career, because I know that you first were an intern at the Florida Capitol in Tallahassee, and then eventually worked in politics and served as the chief legislative aide for 2 different senators there.
Yes, sir. I feel very blessed. That's why I'm a big proponent for internships. UCF, University of Central Florida, selected me, and I got to serve during the 2009 legislative session. And that's where I got the bug. I said, I just love this, helping people, problem solving, seeing these elected officials too as everyday people. They were teachers, they were business owners, parents, you name it, all different walks of life. And I saw this as a college student coming together to tackle issues that were important to them. And so I feel very blessed that that internship opened the door to a beautiful 12-year career working in the House, going over to the Senate, and being able to serve, but also getting to see the toll that it takes on elected officials when they're away from their homes, away from their churches, seeking God in the midst of, kind of like what the Acts Church did too, right? You're in the middle of the city waiting for the day of Pentecost, and it's loud and it's noisy, and you're trying to find that time to seek God. And that's what I saw a lot there, just those that were trying to honor God in their day-to-day, but being so weary at times when every state is different how long they meet. But in Florida, it was 60 days, but you had 9 weeks of committee hearings. So you were driving back and forth to go up there and do your job. So it was an honor to be able to be a part of that firsthand.
Let's go back to your article here, because you talk about legislators need citizens who speak up on their behalf in prayer. And you point out that many of them are just citizens, moms, dads, business owners, employees, who have counted the cost of public service and decided to answer the call. But as you point out, they miss their children's birthdays, their church Sunday school messages, their friends' weddings. Some legislative offices receive over 25,000 visitors a year. So go into that in a little bit, because I don't think people recognize the cost that many citizen legislators pay when they go and serve in their state capital.
Definitely. And, like I said, when you were coming into the office, and our office was very special in that our senator, she loved to send thank you notes to any citizen that visited. So that's why we were able to kind of really keep a tally of every person that made the time to drive up to the Capitol to advocate for an issue. You meet with them, you make the time for them. And even if they're just meeting with staff, it's so important to that individual. And so when you're gone Monday through Friday, sitting in committee hearings that are sometimes 3-4 hours long, and then back into the meeting, and it's all so important what they're doing, but it takes a toll on you just as a person. We're all people. And like I said, there were so many times that, if you're leading your Bible study back home, and this was, prior, I think they do, maybe they're open now to more digital stuff before COVID, but you were gone. I had to stop serving in kids' church. Many others who were leading their studies, you kind of call it quits for about 6 months. So you're able to be really focused on this. And it's physically daunting too, to be, in meetings all day, hearings, researching legislation, making sure you're responding to your constituents, that they know that their voice matters. And it's all the little things too that they do to make sure. Then they're back home if it's a weekend and there's a big event going on in their community, if it's a community fair, you name it. A lot of those senators and representatives on the local level too are there with their staff on the weekends too, helping out, ribbon cuttings or touring great other nonprofits that are out there that are providing support services. So it's definitely a full marathon right there during those months.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Lindsey Swindle. Let me just mention that we do have this article, Speak Up for Your Elected Officials in Prayer. And she points out that during my time serving with state legislators, I remember sitting back on difficult days and praising God that there were people praying for me, which will bring us back to Project KEEP, which stands for Keeping Elected Officials Encouraged Through Prayer. It's been a project of MediShare really since September 11th, 2021. And in some respects, we can really get into what that involves in terms of volunteers praying for elected officials and how many have been prayed for and what some of those prayers might be. So if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know more about that, that is one of our articles on our website. And you can go down to, I guess it's actually our 4th article, and it is one that appeared before in a very important way for you to know more about it in a Christian Post. And so let me just encourage you to look for that during the break. When we come back, we'll talk about a little bit more about Project Keep and what Lindsey has been putting together. All that coming up right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Lindsey Swindle with us. And let me just mention, next hour we're going to have in studio with us Lathan Watts, again, Vice President of Public Affairs for Alliance Defending Freedom. We'll get into some of the cases before the Supreme Court, one that's already been heard, another one coming up, and many other issues we will cover. But Lindsey, if we can, as a Director of Government and Policy Affairs at Christian Care Ministry, which of course is MediShare, that was a project that was developed, and it's called Project Keep. Can you tell us more about it?
I sure can. So every month I publish a prayer calendar, and we list elected officials out by name. So about 4 to 5 individuals. We provide a prayer prompt in case you need a little guidance on what that month's focus will be. And when we first started, it was just listing them by name. But as we developed and I was attending, other legislative meetings throughout the states here, I started hearing from legislators, and I wanted them to be able to also share their heart with those that are praying for them. And so I started just doing little interviews and hearing from elected officials, what led them to run for office, what does prayer mean to them, and how can we specifically be praying? I mean, how powerful it is when you know that there is an exact need and that we're able to stand and believe with them that month. And so we highlight an individual, a legislator that I was able to interview for about a minute and a half that also goes out with the prayer calendar monthly. And we've just seen it slowly be growing, and other to people that they're hearing about it, their hearts changing to, again, seeing that these are real people, not just kind of these off the far away government officials, but real people that are asking for prayer, and how we can support them in it. And you just see their countenance to change. The legislators, when I walk up to them saying like, hey, we're praying for you this month specifically. And it's just such an encouragement to them as they go through their day.
Well, again, you've been doing this for many years, so talk about what are some of the prayer needs that these individuals have. We have, of course, a Pray for America, and once a week we send out, and it's written by Liberty, that kind of gives you an overview of a particular issue. But I know that since you're focusing primarily on the officials rather than policy issues, I suspect there are probably some common themes of things they've asked you to pray for.
Yes, definitely. Many, who are just maybe their first time serving. So they're asking for wisdom. They're asking for strength. Many of them, too, then if they've been serving for a long time, then they're asking for those same things of just that every day, kind of like, like the word says, give us this day our daily bread. But they're asking for that guidance. We do hear quite a bit, too, of praying for their families. Many elected officials, they know, and they're throwing their hat into the ring, how difficult it can be, and the things written about them, or, things the challenges that they have to face and stand up for. But it stirs their hearts to knowing that it weighs heavy on their families, on their spouses, their kids. And so many of them, too, ask, can you please pray for covering, protection for my family? And that's kind of been a central theme as well when I've met with individuals, which, again, you see their heart for leadership, that they still are always wanting to prefer others and cover those around them, or praying for their communities if they're facing a natural disaster or something going on. And I've happened to be talking to them then. It's praying for the families that are impacted in their area.
One of the things that I think many people are thinking right now is, after you kind of give us a reminder of what a significant sacrifice sometimes public service is, what would you say to somebody who wants to get maybe involved in the government process?
I would say definitely, you still need your small group. Many senators or House reps shared, they also have a text thread of those that are praying and seeking God on their behalf. But as you spend your quiet time, that you ask the Lord to prepare your heart for the race ahead. Again, ask for that wisdom of His timing, when to step in to serve, but get that good community around you, and that can lift you up, because it is any task that God calls us to do, and we're obedient, but there is a price of time and energy to it. So that would be just my advice. Get good mentors around you as well. I think it's so beautiful when I hear other senators and reps, they talk about leading even just little Bible studies or prayers in their state capitals, so they can stay refreshed and encouraging one another. Like the word says, iron sharpens iron.
Let me just mention that we do have a link to the website there. You can go to votervoice.net, but it's just simpler to follow the link we have at pointofview.net. It will take you to Christian Care Ministry Action Center. And there, first of all, is a video that you can watch. There's a place where you can register and join and actually receive what's called a prayer calendar. So when people go to that website and register, what will they receive?
They'll just receive an email that attaches the monthly prayer calendar. It's just once a month. We don't send anything else out. And it'll have a link to an interview spotlighting one of the legislators sharing the importance of prayer in their life. So that's it. Super simple. You can sign up online. And also the other link is metashare.com/Project Keep.
And again, I would encourage you to find out more about Metashare. We've, of course, talked about the Christian Care Ministry in the past, and we have information about that as well, and have in the past. But I would encourage those of you that really have a ministry of prayer, sign up. I think if you are certainly concerned about the pressures that your own legislators are facing right now, you can sign up. And so, Lindsey, first of all, I want to thank you for writing this article that appeared in Christian Post. We've posted that. We also, under your picture there, have actually provided the link to Christian Care Ministries Action Center, and that's a place where people can sign up and find out a little bit more. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And see you all out in the communities on May 1st for National Day of Prayer.
Again, National Day of Prayer on Thursday. We will, of course, be talking about that. On Thursday, I'll be doing a live broadcast from our friends at KYCC in California, but we'll certainly emphasize that as well. And I understand there's some announcements coming out that day from the Oval Office, and so we'll see what those announcements might be. We'll be talking about that as well. Just before we take a break, let me just mention a couple of things. First of all, last hour, of course, we were talking about the whole idea of illegal aliens, and if you did not see this, it's got to make you roll your eyes or smile or something, and that is the other day we heard that the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, that would be Secretary Kristi Noem, had her purse stolen at an establishment in Washington, D.C. The masked robber made off with I guess it was a Gucci bag, had a lot of money in it. Why was she carrying that much cash? I do not know. But, okay, and think about this for just a minute. The Secretary of Homeland Security is supposed to work with the problem of illegal aliens. And guess who, it turns out, stole her purse? Guess who stole her purse? An illegal alien. I cannot make this stuff up. But nevertheless, now, according to the news, the suspect who was arrested Saturday in the theft of Secretary Kristi Noem's purse is in the country illegally. U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia said in an interview. Ed Martin said that a second suspect was also in the country illegally and being sought for law enforcement. So you, as I said before, cannot make this up. An individual charged with preventing illegal aliens to come into this country is herself an individual who was actually robbed by an illegal alien. And if nothing else, probably stiffen the spine of Kristi Noem to work even harder to prevent that kind of thing from happening to someone else. Just thought that was an interesting sideline about some of the other things we've been talking about. We come back, though, we're going to spend some time with our good friend Lathan Watts. He is the Vice President of Public Affairs for Alliance Defending Freedom. They have a case going before the Supreme Court. We also last week talked about a case that was argued before the Supreme Court. I'm going to get his thoughts on a couple of very important religious liberty cases. All that coming out right after this.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
My husband and I are your supporters. We just really appreciate the show and the people you bring on.
I just want to commend you guys on your program. I love listening to you. It's a blessing. Been listening to you for several years. Your program has helped my family see current events and elections and politics through the eyes and the principles of Scripture. And that's been enlightening, and we're trying to pass that on to others.
I want to say, first of all, that I really enjoyed the Millennial Roundtable, and I love the program altogether. I think Kerby is great, and I really appreciate all of y'all, all that y'all do, and the truth that y'all put out.
Hey, great show. Love all your comments and what you're talking about.
Thanks again for what you do.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, as we mentioned before, we have Lathan Watts in the studio with us. Of course, he is the Vice President for Public Affairs for Alliance Defending Freedom, ADFlegal.org, but you don't have to remember all that, because we have a link there to a case that we're going to talk about, the Drummond case. It's Oklahoma statewide charter school board versus Drummond. Has to do with school choice, has to do with a charter school, has to do with religious liberty, and that one will be one that we'll be talking about for a while. But then we'll come back to one I mentioned last week, Mahmoud versus Taylor. That was the one out of the state of Maryland. So we're going to go to Maryland and Oklahoma and a number of other places, especially Montgomery County. And some of the oral arguments caused Lathan to shake his head a little bit, and we'll get into some of that as well. Before we're done, we'll also talk about the fact that there's a task force that this administration has put together, President Trump as well as Pam Bondi and others, to address anti-Christian bias in the federal government, and we'll talk about some of those stories as well. But first of all, Lathan, you're supposed to be with us last week, but you had some work to do in Austin, so it's great to have you in studio.
Yes, I appreciate you being flexible, and good to be here. Glad I could be here today.
Always appreciate you, because you not only give us the legal perspective, but of course your history background is very good. Let's get into this one in Oklahoma, because what I've posted was actually your press release that came out in January, in which you were at the time announcing the Supreme Court has agreed to hear this case. Now we're going to hear the oral arguments, and we'll probably cover it after the oral arguments come out. But this is a very important case in two areas, religious liberty and kind of school choice, isn't it?
It is, and it'll be argued on the 30th, so that's this week. So,
there we go.
Jim
Wednesday.
Campbell is arguing that for us. And we represent the charter school board in Oklahoma in this case. So a little bit of the legalese or the technicality. So Oklahoma created a school choice program, created a charter school board that evaluates applications. They invited private institutions to operate charter schools in the state, and that board approves those organizations. St. Isidore Catholic Church operates this charter school, applied, and the former Attorney General of Oklahoma actually advised the board that if you exclude them simply because it's a Catholic organization, that runs afoul of First Amendment law, and the board approved them. A new Attorney General in Oklahoma, Mr. Drummond, I guess disagreed with the previous Attorney General and a large stack of case law, in my opinion,
yes,
and advised the board to deny the program.
Just throw him out. Yeah,
the board did not. Litigation ensued, and here we are. So
yes,
that's kind of where we are. And like I said, it'll be argued on Wednesday. But so even though on the surface it is about educational freedom, people should have options as to how their children are educated. Parents know best what model of school is going to work best for them, which is why Oklahoma created the program in the first place. But the religious liberty angle of it is this Attorney General of Oklahoma is trying to exclude this one organization because it's religious.
Only it wasn't like they were doing something wrong,
right,
or they had a scandal or something like that. It was just, you're religious, you're out,
Exactly, and that has been litigated in a lot of different contexts multiple times.
I know.
And the Supreme Court has been pretty consistent. If you have a program that is available to the public, you cannot keep religion out of it simply because it's religion.
Right.
And that's what's going on here. So I don't want to jinx my good friend Jim Campbell, but I'm cautiously optimistic that the court's going to get this right.
I would think so.
You're relying on a lot of different precedent, a lot of the very old laws going back to late 1800s, early 1900s into the 20s, called Blaine Amendments.
The Blaine Amendment, which was anti-Catholic at its core. Yes,
bias.
It was. That's right. Yes.
And those have been challenged in court in
numerous times.
Yes. And the Supreme Court has over and over again said, you don't have to have this program, but if you have this program, you can't keep a religious organization out of it just because it's a religious organization.
Let's remind our listeners, because we were talking about whether or not you could have access to playground materials, and everybody had playground materials except if it was going to be a religious playground, as if the playground knew any difference between it being religious and secular. We have had cases, first of all, a significant number from Maine, because it seems like they just can't quite get the program up there in Maine, California, and other places. Montana. I mean, I'm just picking the ones I know, and I'm not even into it like you guys are. It just seems to be so significant. But what I thought was interesting is the piece that we've posted here comes from Jim Campbell, who will be arguing that on the issue of choice. Okay, back away on religious for just a second. He says Oklahoma parents and children are better off with more educational choices, not fewer. This is a great irony in state officials who claim to be in favor of religious liberty discriminating against St. Isidore because of its Catholic beliefs. The U.S. Constitution protects St. Isidore's freedom to operate according to its faith and supports the board's decision to approve such learning options for Oklahoma families. Even if you are maybe ambivalent about religious, non-religious, more choices is better. And it's better for your kids, and it's better for the taxpayers who are actually paying for the schools, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the whole argument behind, the school choice movement. And there are now, I think, 20-ish states that have some sort of school choice option in their state. And Texas just passed.
Yes.
I'm not sure if Governor Abbott signed it yet, but Texas is one of the more recent ones to establish a school choice program for all the reasons that you said.
Yes.
More options for parents who know best what is going to work best for their students, and frankly, competition. Typically improves performance.
Yes, so. Well, and the Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, she seems like she's for school choice too, because I'm going to make you smile now, because she was saying, well, if you don't like the school, you can always homeschool, which I thought, isn't that interesting? We're going to get that in just a minute, but I had to make you smile on that one, didn't I?
Yeah, smile and or grit my teeth. It might look the same.
It might look the same, but nevertheless, we are talking about a very important case before the Supreme Court. And it is a prayer target. So I don't know if Liberty has already put together our prayer target for the week, but nevertheless, let me encourage you to recognize that the oral arguments will be heard on Wednesday, the 30th. Then you can give me the background maybe after we come back from the break. But as I understand, they gather together and they kind of figure out how is everybody coming down on that issue. It could be a 7-2. I fear it's going to be more like a 6-3. Hopefully it won't be a 5-4, but we'll see. Decision in favor of course, the school board and the state of Oklahoma, not the Attorney General. But we'll see how that unfolds. So again, it's a very important prayer target. So we'll come back and talk a little bit more about its significance and how that fits together. And once again, another Supreme Court precedent, which if indeed it comes down, again, I don't want to jinx it, but I think it's pretty obvious which way this is going to come down. It just means that you will have more religious freedom after that decision than you have right now. And we have more religious freedom now than we've had in decades. So you may not hear about that in the legacy media. They may not even really understand the issue. We're talking about it every single day here on Point of View. So we'll finish up with that one. We'll talk about the case in Maryland and Montgomery County. That one does get your head kind of shaking a little bit. And we'll come back with Lathan Watts right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The Trump administration froze federal grants to Harvard University and set in motion a debate about what the president can do when universities defy an executive order and a Supreme Court decision. This confrontation first began when the Trump administration threatened to pull federal funding from Columbia University because administrators did little to stop anti-Semitism on campus. When the Trump administration tried the same tactic, Harvard did not comply. The Harvard president declared that no government, regardless of which party is in power, should decide what private universities can teach, whom they can admit and hire, and which areas of study and inquiry they can pursue. Harvard's transgressions go beyond their refusal to rein in anti-Semitism against Jewish students. The Supreme Court ruled against Harvard's admission practices that discriminated against potential Asian students, and Donald Trump issued an executive order to dismantle DEI. Both the Obama and Biden administrations threatened colleges with their unconstitutional interpretation of Title IX. The Trump administration is not only threatening but pulling university funding and has even asked the IRS to investigate whether Harvard should be allowed to keep its tax-exempt status. I wonder if Trump is creating a precedent that a future president might use against Christian colleges, charities, and institutions. This isn't just hypothetical. Nearly 50 years ago, the IRS stripped Bob Jones University of its tax-exempt status. The Trump administration may not affect Harvard since it has built up an endowment of $50 billion, but other institutions would not be able to endure a future administration that pulls federal funding or tax exemption. That is why this federal action is so important. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, let's open up the phones because we're going to be getting into some of these cases of religious liberty. Love to know if you have some thoughts about that. It's, of course, this case sort of gets you into the issue of school choice, but also the issue of religious liberty. And Lathan, when you think about this, maybe not in this case, although I'm still trying to figure out the Attorney General of the state of Oklahoma, given the fact that it's a red state, and that's kind of not exactly where the state is. You go to Maine, and here you had a case, and this is with our friends at First Liberty, where they said, well, you can actually have access to school choice and these vouchers unless it's religious. So the Supreme Court rules against them. So then they go back and say, well, we maybe even allow it religious, but if they have this particular statement in the doctrinal statement, which I think sets aside the idea that, well, they just haven't been paying attention to what the Supreme Court has ruled, or they're just, because sometimes you know as well as I do, whether it's First Liberty, ADF, or whoever it might be, sometimes when you educate the school administrator, they go, oh, I didn't know that. But in most of these cases, there just seems to be a very deliberate attempt to go after religious people. And it just is amazing to me.
Yeah, unfortunately, sometimes that's the case. And I agree with you sometimes at the local level where an issue pops up in a school, maybe it is, and we always try to give them the benefit of the doubt and to try to explain what the law really requires. And sometimes maybe it is a local, superintendent or principal who just, wasn't updated on, the recent Supreme Court cases or whatever. But, there's an old saying that says, like, when someone shows you who they really are, believe them. Mm-hmm. Right. So
yes.
When they keep coming and saying, well, we know the Supreme Court said this, but what about this? Mm-hmm. Well, we know the Supreme Court said that's unconstitutional too, but if you have this statement, we think we can get, it's pretty obvious what they're doing.
Yeah.
And, it's unfortunate that sometimes you have to keep going back to the court over and over again on the same issue, but, we keep building the case law, which makes decisions or cases further down the line, if this issue keeps coming up, it makes them easier to win.
Right.
The more wins you stack up on that issue.
That's right.
Like you mentioned, Espinoza out of Montana was our case. The playground case, Trinity Lutheran, that's our case. We're building the case law.
That's what you're doing. Yeah.
And so that those wins kind of multiply in impact. And so, if we win this one, hopefully will be our, I believe, 17th win of the Supreme Court in the last 12 to 13 years.
And let's talk about that for a minute, the value of those precedents, because years ago, and I mean, now I'm talking about decades ago, I think it was the first time I was the host of Point of View, and that's in the 1980s. So that's a while ago. I did have a chance to interview an individual that had been an ACLU lawyer who then became a Christian, and he was explaining at the time why some of these cases were coming down. First of all, there was a Christian legal society, but there was no Alliance Defending Freedom. There was no First Liberty. There was not even a Jim Dobson doing radio. Okay, so all of a sudden you had a 60s case, another 60s case, another 60s cases. By the time we got to the 1970s, we were winning because we had so many precedents locked up that by the time you got to Stone versus Graham in 1980 you can't even post the 10 Commandments in a classroom. They were just winning everything. And then, of course, he became a Christian and said, I learned that we need to do the same. And that's, of course, why Alliance Defending Freedom and Jim Dobson and Marlon Maddox and D. James Kennedy and Larry Burkett and others started ADF, because you had to do what you're now doing. And in some respects now, if you are trying to counter this whole idea of religious liberty, you really have to drive upstream. You have to drive uphill, whatever illustration you want to use, because so many of the precedents have come the direction towards religious liberty.
Yes, thankfully, and it's a long game, and we talk about that internally at ADF all the time, that we are playing the long game, and so we are looking for, the right cases, the right issues in the right circuits in the right states, to build upon the precedents that already exist, to strengthen those, but then if necessary, to correct other old bad decisions that are still on the books, but. In terms of the the Establishment Clause jurisprudence of the First Amendment, there's been a huge shift in the last, say, 20 to 30 years. And I think it's a shift in the right direction. It's back towards the original meaning and intent of the Establishment Clause. We're not going to have a state-sponsored official church in the United States of America. And that's pretty much it. It took a lot of lawyers and judges to complicate something that simple, and they did for a long time, to where you got to the point where, can a kid bring a candy cane with a Merry Christmas message at a public school, where it got to the point where it was so outrageous that the original intent of the First Amendment had been twisted, to a point where it was unrecognizable. And those early cases would have been harder to win because of the precedents that were on the books. But once you start to win and you start building, as I said before, you build upon the precedents, then it makes your argument stronger the next time you're back up there, and it helps sort of maybe fix some problems before they get to that point. So if an issue pops up at a school district, and you can pull up the last 5-6 Supreme Court cases ADF has won, and show that to the school district, like, this is actually what the law is. And we've had people tell us that they've done that. That I took your press release and this op-ed and I went and I put them on the table and was like, this is what it is. And
we got it.
And they they got the outcome that they wanted. So sometimes these court cases produce wins that we don't even know about.
Yes. And I think that's the ultimate idea. You open the door, and then just to restore freedom in America, let people go do that. Well, I want to back into the case of the one from Montgomery County by using, again, the quotes from Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. And that is our second article by Kimberly Ross, because she points out that she was, quote, struggling to see how it burdens a parental religious exercise if the school teaches something the parent disagrees with. You don't have to send your kid to the school. You can put them in another situation. And of course, everybody jokingly said, oh, well, she was endorsing school choice. But no, think about this for a minute. Let's take your two cases out of Colorado, both out of Colorado, one having to do with Jack Phillips' Masterpiece Cake Shop, in which he said, look, I can bake you a cake, but I'm not going to use my creativity on that cake to endorse whether it's the homosexual same-sex marriage or whether it's a gender transition. You had another case, I think it was in that Lori Smith, if I remember, that was
Right.
303 Creative, and saying I can't actually go and do a wedding site and all of that online for your particular website. And yet it seems to me that on the one hand, if I don't like what you're doing, the idea that there are other bakeries or other web designers is not a good argument. But on the case of whether or not you are maybe wondering whether or not your Christian kids or your Muslim kids should learn about the pride puppy or about this boy or girl that thinks she's the opposite sex, well, then there are plenty of schools. And it just seems to me that you can't have it both ways, can you?
No, I listened to some of the oral argument in that case. I didn't get a chance to hear all of it. Just if you want to know what level of legal nerd I am, yes, I was listening to an oral argument. ADF did file an amicus brief in that case.
Yes, you were involved in that indirectly, sure.
And yeah, I was struck by that comment from Justice Jackson. Well, I don't see how this is a burden on your free exercise of religion. Just take them to a different school. And I'm like, setting aside for a minute the "let them eat cake" tone,
let them eat cake
of that comment.
She didn't understand it's a school district.
This is a school district policy, which means, okay, so I take my kid out of this school and I go to the school 3 streets over. The policy is going to be the same. It is a district-wide policy, so you would have to take that student completely out of that school district. And so either she doesn't understand the difference between a school and a school district, or she was just kind of haphazardly analyzing this. But school districts, they're set up, you're zoned, it's geographic. So by her logic, you would have to take that kid completely out of the district if the policy is the same for the whole district, which not a lot of people may not be able to afford to afford a private school or afford the commute to get that kid to I don't know if Maryland has a school choice program. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But the point of that case is they're saying that parents cannot opt their kid out of this curriculum. So the real
about
question,
as heavy-handed as you can come up with.
It is, and it really gets down to who is in charge.
Yes.
Who is in charge of your child?
And really, both these cases are about parental choice, but we need to take a break, and they're also about religious choice and about deeply held religious beliefs. But one of the reasons they wouldn't let them opt out, I love this, is because too many parents tried to opt out. Wouldn't you think maybe that would send a signal that maybe you've got a bad policy? We'll take a break, and we'll continue our conversation with Lathan Watts. We'll take some phone calls, too. 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. Be right back.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult. And that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Lathan Watts with us, and we're talking about this case that has already been heard before the Supreme Court. It's also a good prayer target. It was actually brought by the Beckett Fund, and I just might mention that even though it's not an ADF case, you had an amicus brief before it, talking about 20 different books as part of the curriculum that actually promote pride parades, gender transition, pronoun preferences for children. But Lathan, how strategic was it that this case is known as Mahmoud versus Taylor, because they put the Muslim parents up in front, and you had to acknowledge at least that a Muslim parent would want to opt their children out if a lesson showed the kids pictures of Muhammad, which would be, according to the Muslim faith, a violation. So right off the bat, you had to acknowledge that opting your children out was something Muslim students would have to do. And I think it was really smart to put the Muslim kids front and center in that case.
Probably from a PR perspective and a messaging perspective. It gets to the core of when you win a religious liberty case. Our clients are typically, it's a broad spectrum of ecumenical Christianity. But those wins protect people of all faith and people of no faith. Mm-hmm. So if you live in that school district and you're agnostic, but you don't want a kindergartner to hear anything about issues related to sexuality because you don't think a 5-year-old is capable of processing this information and or you want to be the person that has that conversation with them, not the school district. If Beckett wins this case, and I hope and pray that they do, you will now have the right as a person of no faith whatsoever to opt your kid out of that because you have a set of ideals or beliefs that you want to live by. And that's the beauty of religious liberty in a country that welcomes people of varying faith traditions or none at all. At the core of it is the right to live your life according to what you believe in all aspects of your life. And you don't surrender that by sending your kid to a government school. Yes. You don't surrender that by opening a business in the marketplace. You don't surrender that. That is the beauty of the First Amendment. And so, I found it interesting that was the student's name that they decided to put forward, knowing that would be the name of the case.
Yes.
But it demonstrates the principle and why.
Right. And religious liberty is for everyone, and as you said, for no one, because I know one of the plaintiffs in the case was a mother, and I can't remember if she had a religious background or not, but she talked about her son who is Downs and has difficulty understanding that, or maybe there was the other one. Oh, I remember the other one was even worse because the child was having difficulty making distinctions sometimes between like male and female anyway. So nothing more confusing for a child. I think maybe it was on the maybe on the autistic spectrum. That was the one I was looking at, and then saying, well, then we have this story that we're going to read in an English class, by the way, not even in human sexuality class, about a girl who actually thinks she's a boy. And so the point that was being made is that even if you're not even religious, this goes beyond religious liberty. It really goes to the fundamental core issue of parental rights, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, parents and parental rights are pre-political.
Yes.
Parental rights existed before there was a constitution.
Yes.
And I mean, that is written in the law of nature and nature's God, to quote Jefferson, that parents have the primary responsibility and therefore the primary authority for the upbringing of their children. And I mean, I feel for the parent of the autistic child who has trouble distinguishing. I mean, I travel a lot for work. I'm in a lot of airports, and I can tell you, I've got trouble distinguishing a lot of people that I've seen in airports. Let alone, so I feel bad for this kid.
Can't figure it out.
Kids today that are growing up in a world that is much, much different than the one you and I did. And that parent has the right to decide whether or not their child is going to hear that. So hopefully Beckett is successful in this one.
Well, and again, one of the other things that I thought was kind of interesting is that there were stories that in some cases were just supposed to kind of educate them about same-sex couples, transgender people, drag queens. But one of those was about a little girl who was actually learning about her uncle's gay wedding. And so the implication of that was, well, even though you don't necessarily have to agree with the uncle, But yes, it's the little girl that's trying to figure that out. And Chief Justice John Roberts really asked, how realistic is it for a 5-year-old to be told that you don't have to believe what your teacher actually teaches, given the fact that they've sort of idolized their teacher at that age. Justice Samuel Alito then reads from that little book, which at that point you do get the sense that they had not read that before, because that's when, again, Justice Sonia Sotomayor said, well, it's just fine that the girl's objection was there, but never mind the fact that you were basically teaching a lesson with that. So it's almost like they hadn't heard the story, hadn't read the book, and they hear about it and go, well, yeah, but it's still possible for a young girl that hears that story to object or maybe even agree with that young girl who didn't understand her uncle's gay wedding. And you're asking a lot of young children who have very little discernment at that age. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was one of the things that struck me in the parts of the argument that I did get to listen to. It was clear that some of the justices had read the books that were in question.
Yeah. And they seem to be the more conservative justices.
And like you said, Alito quoted from one of them, started reading from it. So that stood out to me as I was listening.
One other one I jump to, and then we'll go on to some other issues. Brett Kavanaugh, Justice Kavanaugh, at one point, this is his quote, "I'm a bit mystified as a lifelong resident of the county how this came to be. And really, is this the hill you want to die on?" And one of the comments that was made by Dan McLaughlin is, first of all, I doubt he was mystified by this, having lived in Montgomery County, Maryland. But more importantly, it was, I think, also maybe a little bit powerful to the court, because some of the liberal justices recognize, this is happening in their backyard, and some people have lived in this county. It's not like happening in Oregon or Montana or Alaska. Right. They know what's going on there. And so I loved the fact that he said, probably with his tongue in his cheek, I'm a bit mystified why you want to make this the hill you want to die on.
You're not having a good day at the office when anybody who is as educated as somebody like Justice Kavanaugh starts a sentence with "I'm mystified" or "help me understand," because what he's about to do is eviscerate your argument.
Yes, very much so. Well, anyway, those are two cases, but I thought just before we wind down today, and we'll have another segment where we can get into this in more detail, love to get your thoughts about the fact that, as some people like to say, there's a new sheriff in town, and it isn't just the chief sheriff, that is Donald Trump. It is Pam Bondi, who's the Attorney General, and they have put together a task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias. And I just thought, first of all, let me go to somebody you know very well, and that is Michael Ferris, who has been up until recently the head of Alliance Defending Freedom. And he pointed out how under the Biden Internal Revenue Service, they targeted Pastor Gary Hamrick and the Cornerstone Church for alleged violations of the Johnson Amendment. Now, that was passed by Lyndon Johnson when he was a senator. It's been used to muzzle conservative pastors. And then you also have Scott Hicks, who's the provost of Liberty University, explaining how the Biden administration slammed Liberty with the largest fines in history, while at the same time turning what looked like a blind eye to anti-Semitism in some of the other universities. So if you're looking for cases, you got a few right in front of you.
We're plenty busy. Yeah. And I don't know if that's
unbelievable.
Yeah, it's one of the odd things about what I do for a living in the organization that I work for, is that we love being busy, but we're also really sad that we're that busy. I mean, we're happy that we're winning, but it's an odd thing to say. Like, we would love to be able to work ourselves right out of business.
Yes,
but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon.
Yes,
and those are plenty. There's plenty of examples why we're going to be busy for a while.
Yes. And one of those is, of course, that Johnson Amendment. You were hoping at some point that one of these pastors would be controversial enough that they would be prosecuted, because you were looking for what's called standing, weren't you?
Well, the thing about the Johnson Amendment, the IRS really hasn't enforced it because because it exists on paper. A lot of people self-censor because of it.
Right.
And so I think it's been difficult for people who would like to get a court challenge to it to get a case, because the IRS, I think, knows if they did truly try to enforce that, how quickly it would be challenged, and they would lose in court. And so keeping it on the books gets people to self-censor.
Yeah, interesting. We'll come back and talk about a few more of those cases of anti-Christian bias, and that's coming up right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention again that there is the President Trump's task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias. And what I thought was so striking is, of course, we quoted from a few people. Michael Farris used to be the head of Alliance Defending Freedom and Scott Hicks at Liberty University. But what was so interesting is to have cabinet officers, one of those, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, saying that Christian employees in the State Department were threatened with child abuse investigations if they wanted to homeschool their children. Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert F. Kennedy Jr. reported the Biden administration implemented new rules making it harder for Christians to become foster parents. And of course, we just talked with Lindsey Swindle last hour about that. So there are a couple of really important issues that we need to address. And again, just some things that I think we need to understand because of what is actually happening right now in terms of even in the administration. So the good news is some of these Supreme Court cases might make it easier for Christians to actually work within the administration.
Yeah, I would hope so. I mean, I think for a long time there was a, whether it's in the legacy media or in previous administrations or even under conservative administrations, this idea that that there was sort of an institutional bias against traditional Christian belief was almost treated like a conspiracy theory.
Yes.
And but it's like, I have to get all new conspiracy theories because my old ones keep getting proved right, And so the more things come out like this and you see like more and more examples of it, it does kind of hopefully kind of puncture that way of thinking of, that doesn't really happen. Well, actually, yeah, it has. And here's some examples. So, the devil's always in the details, how do you,
right.
Eradicate it and the process that you do that. But even the fact that, there's a task force established to do something about it is a step in the right direction.
Right.
And we have, the proof's always in the pudding. We're going to have to wait and see what the task force suggests and how they want to implement it and all those things. And making sure that, whatever is implemented is done in a way that, is constitutional and respects the First Amendment and can't be weaponized the other way around.
That's a good question
in
too.
A new administration who doesn't share these ideas. So cautiously optimistic, but it's like a lot of things. We'll see.
We'll see. But again, one of the things we're talking about are policies. We want to make sure we have policies that can work either way. But personnel are policy, and I thought that was something else that came out here because in the past you've had under the Biden administration, they were telling chaplains that they could not give overtly Christian sermons at veterans hospitals. Well, all it takes is to have the right Doug Collins in there as a veterans administration, and that one just goes away instantaneously. You had the FBI for a while was spying on conservative churches, including Catholic churches, and identifying traditional Catholics as potential domestic extremists. Don't think that's happening anytime soon, right, under this administration.
My colleague, Jeremy Tedesco, testified in Congress last year, I believe.
Yeah.
In the House subcommittee on the weaponization of government, because FinCEN, that investigates financial crimes, had contacted the largest banks, the ones that are heavily regulated by the federal government, and basically asked them to surveil their customers for potential domestic terrorists. And the criteria they gave them were, do they buy religious texts?
Yes.
Do they shop at places like Cabela's or Bass Pro or Dick's Sporting Goods, places that sell firearms? Or do they donate to organizations like Alliance Defending Freedom? And listed us by name as one of the criteria. So we were up there testifying in Congress because the subcommittee turned up this information and hey, did you guys know about this? And we're like, that makes every one of our supporters, which is why we can take these cases and not charge the clients, a potential target of these types of investigations. So yes, we will absolutely be there to testify. So hopefully that is getting cleaned up over the Treasury Department and all agencies of the federal government.
And last time we were talking about this whole idea of debanking, and that is an issue. And then, of course, how some of these major institutions like Walmart and others are getting rid of woke. So sometimes it's the policy, sometimes it's the person. The other one I love to use is that they had actually had this painting of Jesus Christ that was posted for many years at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. Well, the Biden administration said, we can't have that, and so we take it down to the basement, put the right person in, and put it back up, and there was to applause. So sometimes it's resolved through policies, sometimes it's resolved through personnel, but I do believe that some things are changing, not only in terms of the cases that you are winning, but also some of the right people that are getting put into those positions, and people that you've worked with in the past, both at Alliance Defending Freedom and at First Liberty, they're actually in the administration now, aren't they?
Yeah, there are some. That's always, it's a good problem to have, when a presidential administration is poaching some of your good people.
Yes.
But, we wish them well, hope they do a good job, and maybe they'll come back. We'll see. But, you mentioned like the debanking and the things going on in the private sector and these things that are going on. Really what it demonstrates, our founders were keenly aware of the threat to liberty posed by the concentration of power.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Constitution they crafted, when it's adhered to, is pretty effective at alleviating the concentration of power in government.
Yes.
That's why you got the three branches. They're separate. They're co-equal. They can challenge each other. It's supposed to keep that concentration from happening. But the concentration of power in the private sector can
economic
be just as big a threat to certain liberties as it is in the government. Now, the Constitution doesn't deal with that because it's in the private sector, which is why ADF has started engaging in corporate America and trying to get companies to change policies to respect diversity of opinion, not DEI, like skin deep diversity, but how are you dealing with the diversity of opinion within your workforce, within your customer base, within your vendors, your clients. And so that's another big area of focus for us right now because, let's say we could just, like wave a wand, we've got it all fixed in the government. I don't think that's happening anytime soon, but just for the sake of argument, you still have
economic power,
a concentration of power in the private sector.
Yes,
if you look at the three biggest banks in America,
I know
they control. I may get this stat wrong, but I think it's over half the deposit accounts in America between about three banks. Yeah, and if they have
and then you got fund managers like BlackRock and others, and they control so much.
Exactly. Trillions of dollars in investments and savings and everything else. And access to the free market cannot be based on ideology. I mean, you want to talk about a God-given right to the pursuit of happiness. It's pretty hard to do if you can't participate in a free market economy. And a free market must be truly free. It must be free of discrimination. And so there are things going on, efforts that we're making, within corporate America and some of the state legislatures to address this issue of debanking. Tennessee was the first state to pass something last year. Idaho passed it this year. It's pending in several states this year, including Texas, where we are. And so that's another issue that we're working on. And it's another one of those, like we said, we're playing the long game. We're not going to get it fixed overnight.
To our website, pointofview.net, and type in debanking, you'll see 3 of my commentaries, your article, and a couple of others. But also, when you go there, you can find the link to adflegal.org. And as I think you've illustrated only so well, you still have work to do. And so job security is around for now because of the tremendous number of threats to religious liberty, and we're glad that you're out there fighting. And I would encourage you to click on that button to actually support that. And they are looking for monthly partners, and your first gift is actually matched. So if you'd like to donate to adflegal.org, we've made it easy for you to do so. Always great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Always great to have Megan helping with us, engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.